The monk has fathered a child with a woman. He assaulted her. He is no holy man. He's a demon disguised as a monk. These accusations tore through the village like a storm, shattering the peaceful community that had once revered the monk as a symbol of virtue. The words spread from house to house, market to market, growing more venomous with each retelling. Suspicion seeped into every corner of the small village, nestled quietly between the mountains. For years, this village had been a haven of tranquility. Its simple way of life centered around the temple that stood at its heart. The monk, who had dedicated his life to humility and service, was beloved by all. He had offered blessings for newborns, guidance for the troubled, and comfort for the grieving. His presence had been a cornerstone of the village's harmony. But now, that harmony was cracking. It all began one fateful day when a young woman arrived at the temple gates. Her appearance was striking, not for beauty, but for her condition. Her clothes hung in tatters, her face was pale with exhaustion, and her hands clutched her swollen belly protectively. She stood trembling, her eyes darting with fear as if the world itself was hunting her down. "Master, please help me. I have nowhere else to go," she pleaded, her voice trembling with desperation as tears streaked down her dirt-streaked cheeks. The monk, standing at the temple steps, looked down at her. His eyes softened, filled with both compassion and sorrow. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his robes brushing against the ground, and extended a hand. "Come inside," he said gently. He led her into the temple, offering her food and shelter. She ate in silence, her trembling hands barely able to hold the bowl of rice he had placed before her. When she finished, she whispered a quiet "thank you" and looked at him with an expression of gratitude that words could not fully convey. From that day on, she stayed at the temple. The monk offered her sanctuary, a safe place where she could rest and prepare for the child she carried. But the villagers, who often visited the temple for blessings and prayers, noticed her presence. At first, it was only whispers. "Who is she? Why is she staying at the temple? Have you seen her? She's pregnant. Do you think it's his?" The whispers soon turned into rumors, spreading through the village like wildfire. Suspicion began to cloud the minds of the people who had once held the monk in the highest regard. "How can a monk take in a woman like her, especially in her condition?" one man said angrily at the marketplace. "It doesn't make sense. He must be hiding something," another added, his voice low but filled with certainty. The rumors grew darker with each retelling. People began to talk openly, their words laced with anger and contempt. "I saw her sweeping the temple yard the other day. She's clearly settled there," an elderly woman exclaimed to her neighbors. "And she's not leaving anytime soon," another replied. The temple, once a place of reverence and peace, became the center of the village's gossip. Where there was once respect and devotion, there was now doubt and scorn. The monk, unaware of the full extent of the villagers' suspicions, continued his daily routines. Each morning, he swept the temple yard, chanted prayers, and meditated under the Bodhi tree. The young woman helped him with chores, tending to the garden and cleaning the temple halls. Though they worked in silence, a quiet understanding passed between them. Unbeknownst to them, the villagers' whispers were growing louder. The accusations, once confined to private conversations, were now spoken openly, tarnishing the monk's name. The tranquility of the small village was unraveling, and the temple stood at the center of the storm. The rumors surrounding the temple continued to grow, casting a shadow over the once peaceful village. By now, almost every household had heard the whispers about the monk and the young woman. At first, people spoke in hushed tones, but soon their voices grew louder, filled with indignation and certainty. "Do you really think a monk would take in a pregnant woman out of pure kindness?" a woman asked at the marketplace, her basket of vegetables momentarily forgotten. "There's no other explanation," another replied, shaking her head. "He's hiding something, and it's not hard to guess what." As days turned into weeks, suspicion began to take hold of even the most devout followers of the temple. Villagers who once bowed in respect when they passed the temple now cast suspicious glances toward its gates. The sight of the young woman sweeping the yard or watering the plants only fueled their doubts. She walks around like she owns the place, a man muttered as he passed the temple one morning. She's carrying his child, another added grimly. What kind of holy man behaves like this? It wasn't long before the villagers began to confront each other with their suspicions, each adding new details to the story. I heard she arrived late at night, looking disheveled. Doesn't that seem strange? She's probably been staying there for months, and we're just now noticing, another speculated. The temple, once a place of refuge and enlightenment, had become a symbol of scandal. Finally, the villagers decided they could no longer remain silent. One morning, a group of them gathered outside the temple gates. Their faces were grim, their voices laced with accusation. "Monk, you owe us an explanation," shouted an elder, his voice carrying over the quiet courtyard. "Why is she here? What are you hiding?" another demanded, stepping closer to the gates. The monk, who had been meditating under the Bodhi tree, rose slowly. His movements were deliberate, calm, and steady. He approached the gathering crowd, his hands clasped in prayer. "She is here because she needed help," he said gently, his voice unwavering, "and it is my duty to provide it." "Your duty?" a man scoffed. "A monk's duty is to uphold the teachings of purity, not to bring scandal upon the temple." "She is carrying your child, isn't she?" accused another, his voice sharp and cutting. The monk paused, his serene gaze sweeping over the angry crowd. For a moment, the villagers thought he might retaliate, might finally lose the composure that they had once admired so deeply. But instead, he closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his expression calm. To see suffering and turn away would go against the teachings of compassion, he said quietly. "She has done no wrong." The monk's words caused a brief silence to fall over the crowd, but it did little to quell their anger. "Compassion," a woman spat. "What about the reputation of this temple? What about our village?" The tension in the air was palpable, though a few villagers began to doubt their suspicions. The majority remained unconvinced. Their anger simmered just below the surface, and the monk's calm demeanor only seemed to frustrate them further. As the crowd dispersed, muttering among themselves, the monk returned to the temple. The young woman, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward, her face pale with fear. "They hate me," she whispered. "I shouldn't have come here." The monk turned to her, his expression softening. "Do not let their words disturb your heart," he said gently. "Truth always reveals itself, even in the face of darkness." But the days ahead would test the monk's faith in those words, as the villagers' hostility only continued to grow. The whispers of suspicion had now grown into a storm of open hostility. The villagers, unable to reconcile their doubts, found themselves consumed by anger and frustration. One morning, a larger crowd than ever before gathered at the temple gates. Their faces were stern, their voices raised in collective indignation. "This can't go on any longer," an elder declared. "We demand the truth." The gates of the temple, once a symbol of peace, now felt like the walls of a fortress under siege. The monk emerged slowly, his hands clasped in prayer as he stepped onto the temple's threshold. Behind him, the young woman stood silently, her eyes lowered, her presence an unspoken catalyst for the villagers' outrage. "Monk, we have respected you for years," an elderly man began, his voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. "But now you bring shame to this temple and to our village. Explain yourself. Why is she here? Why do you shelter her?" The monk met the elder's gaze with calm composure. "She came seeking help," he replied. "As a follower of the path of compassion, it is my duty to offer refuge to those in need." "Refuge?" a man shouted from the crowd. "Or something more? A pregnant woman? Living here? What are we supposed to believe?" "Do you think we're blind?" another woman added. "She's carrying your child, isn't she?" The young woman flinched at the accusation, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her robe. The monk raised his hand slightly, a silent gesture of reassurance. "She is carrying a child." "Yes," the monk said steadily, "but it is not mine to accuse her, or me. without understanding the truth, is to cause harm where there should be compassion. Compassion, a man sneered. You speak of compassion, but what about the shame you bring upon this village? You expect us to just believe your words? The monk's serene expression did not falter. I do not ask you to believe my words, he said softly. I ask only that you look into your own hearts and find the wisdom to seek truth over judgment. But the villagers were not satisfied. Their frustration simmered, and though some in the crowd began to doubt the accusations, the majority still held firm in their suspicions. Behind the monk, the young woman stepped forward hesitantly. She began, her voice barely audible, but fear silenced her, and she shrank back under the weight of their stares. The tension hung heavy in the air as the crowd slowly dispersed, their mutters filled with anger and uncertainty. The monk watched them leave, his face calm but his heart heavy with the burden of their misunderstanding. Inside the temple, the young woman sat on the floor, her head in her hands. Why don't you tell them the truth? She whispered. They won't listen to me, the monk replied, his tone gentle. The truth will reveal itself in time, and when it does, their hearts will be lighter for having found it themselves. But how long will that take? She asked, her voice trembling. And how much more will they hate us before it happens? The monk placed a hand on her shoulder. Do not let their anger become your own burden, he said. We cannot control their thoughts, but we can choose how we respond. Let your actions, not their words, define you. As the days passed, the villagers' hostility only grew stronger. Stones were thrown at the temple gates, insults were shouted from a distance, and fewer people came to the temple to offer alms. The temple grounds, once a place of peace and community, now felt isolated and somber. Still, the monk carried on as if untouched by the storm of anger around him. Each morning, he swept the temple yard, chanted his prayers, and meditated under the Bodhi tree. The young woman began helping him with these tasks, finding solace in the quiet routines and his unwavering calm. But deep down, both of them knew that the storm had not yet passed, and the truth still waited to be revealed. The villagers' anger reached a boiling point. Each day, their hostility toward the monk and the young woman intensified, fueled by the weight of their own suspicions and frustration. The once revered temple now felt like an eyesore in the heart of the village, a constant reminder of what they believed to be betrayal. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, a group of children, emboldened by the whispers of adults, gathered near the temple gates. They hurled stones, their laughter ringing out amidst cries of "liar" and "disgraceful monk." Inside, the young woman sat trembling, her hands covering her ears. I can't take this anymore, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Why do they hate me so much? I never wanted this. The monk approached her with his usual calm. Their anger is born from misunderstanding, he said, but it is not yours to carry. Their judgment does not define your worth. She looked at him, desperation in her eyes. But what if they never stop? What if they never see the truth? They will, the monk replied, his voice steady. The truth has a way of revealing itself, even when the world tries to bury it. As the days passed, the hostility grew to unbearable levels. No one came to the temple to offer alms. The villagers openly avoided the monk during his alms round, turning their backs on him and muttering insults under their breath. Don't come here anymore, one man spat, throwing a handful of rice to the ground. You're no monk, you're a fraud. The monk bowed respectfully, his hands clasped in gratitude, and walked away in silence. Even as the temple grounds became quieter and lonelier, the monk continued his routines. Each morning, he swept the yard, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he could sweep away the anger that clung to the air. The young woman began helping him with these tasks, her steps growing steadier as she drew strength from his resilience. One fateful evening, the tranquility of the village was broken, not by anger, but by the sudden roar of fire. A great blaze erupted near the village's grain storage, its flames licking the darkening sky. The grain barn is on fire, someone screamed. If we lose it, we'll starve. Villagers rushed to the scene, their faces pale with fear as they saw the fire consuming the barn. The flames roared with fury, and the heat was unbearable. Despite their desperation, no one dared approach. "We can't stop it," a man cried, his voice filled with despair. "It's too dangerous." Just as the crowd began to lose hope, the monk appeared. He walked calmly toward the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. In his hands, he carried buckets of water. "Step aside," he said firmly. The villagers stared in shock as the monk began dousing the flames. The young woman, who had followed him, joined in without hesitation, carrying buckets of water from the nearby well. The two of them worked tirelessly, their movements swift and purposeful, as the villagers watched in stunned silence. But then, amidst the chaos, a figure emerged from the smoke, a man, his body covered in burns, stumbled toward the crowd. His breaths were shallow, and he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The villagers rushed to him, their shock turning to panic. "Who is he?" someone asked. The man struggled to speak, his voice hoarse and weak. "I came back for her," he whispered. "Tell her, I'm sorry for abandoning her and our child." The crowd froze, their eyes wide with realization. "Who is your wife?" someone asked urgently. The man, barely able to lift his hand, pointed toward the temple. "She's at the temple," he rasped, before taking his final breath. The villagers stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. The young woman at the temple, the one they had accused, was his wife. The child she carried was his, not the monk's. The man's final words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The villagers stood frozen, their faces pale and their hearts racing as realization dawned. The accusations they had hurled, the judgment they had passed, all of it had been wrong. The woman at the temple, she's his wife? Someone whispered, their voice trembling. And the child, it's his, not the monk's, another added, their tone laced with guilt. An elder stepped forward, his head bowed. "We accused him unfairly," he said softly, his voice trembling with regret. "All this time, he was only helping her out of compassion." The villagers, overcome with a mix of shame and urgency, hurried toward the temple. They found the monk and the young woman near the well, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fire in the distance. The woman was drenched in sweat, her hands trembling as she passed a bucket to the monk. One of the villagers stepped forward hesitantly. We have something to tell you," he began, his voice faltering. The monk turned, his expression calm but questioning. The villagers relayed the dying man's confession, their voices heavy with emotion. When they finished, the young woman's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands covering her face. "He came back for me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she shook her head in disbelief. "But it's too late." The monk knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "He found peace in seeking forgiveness," he said quietly. "Now it is your turn to find peace by forgiving yourself." The villagers, still reeling from the truth, turned their gaze to the monk. One by one, they stepped forward, their heads bowed low in shame. "We were wrong," an elder said, his voice thick with regret. "We let our suspicions blind us to the truth. Please forgive us." The monk rose to his feet, his serene gaze sweeping over the gathered villagers, his hands clasped together in a gesture of prayer as he bowed deeply. "Compassion and forgiveness are not things I give. They are things we all must practice," he said. "Let this moment teach us to seek understanding before passing judgment, and let it remind us of the power of truth." The villagers knelt before him, their voices trembling as they murmured apologies. The young woman, still overcome with emotion, looked at the crowd, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You hated me," she said softly, "but now you care?" "We were wrong," a woman replied. "We were cruel because we didn't know, but we want to make it right. You belong here now, with us." From that day forward, the villagers treated the monk and the young woman with the utmost reverence. The temple, once the center of scandal and suspicion, became a symbol of hope and redemption. The young woman, who had once felt like an outcast, was embraced as part of the community, and the monk, ever steadfast, continued his daily routines with the same quiet grace, his presence a reminder of the power of compassion and the enduring strength of truth.